Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Brainstorming How to Connect Business Questions to Digital Data. I'm Lindsay Falconer with Automation Services. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers today, Joe Orangel and Kim Jones from Visual Risk IQ. They are integration partners with Automation Services and help us share the joy of data analytics. Today's webcast is worth 1 CPE. In order to receive the CPE credit, you must respond to all 3 polling questions that will be asked throughout today's webcast. We are recording the webcast and we'll share the recording and with you next week when we send out the CPE certificates. You also can download the slides as a handout. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on the right side of your screen. We will try to answer all the questions at the end of the webcast. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Pleasure to be here again this week. And as you described, the purpose of today's webinar is to focus on the brainstorming aspect of data analytics. When I think about other organizations, and pleased to be joined by my partner, Kim Jones, from Austin, Texas, who's also going to be with us today. Kim and I, as many of you all know, have been working together now for nearly 12 years. The first year or so, we were at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where Kim was a consultant to the internal audit practice there, and I was an internal audit services director with PwC. Since 2006, we've been helping audit and compliance and finance teams get up the learning curve with data analytics. We have a repeatable process that we call our QuickStart methodology. And our objectives today are to provide some helpful hints and tricks to get up the learning curve and really create a more repeatable process for data analytics. In our experience, it's sort of like going to the gym, right? It's January, it's the start of the year. We want to make these resolutions. We want to use data on every single audit. We go once, we have a somewhat positive experience, but then how do we go back the second time, the third time, the fourth time to achieve the results that we want? And our winning ways focus here is on creating the audit plans to make the analytics be more repeatable. So with that in mind, we'll jump in. So today's about brainstorming, right? We're not worried about tables and columns and rows just yet. What we're doing is we're planning for the audit, and we want to ask ourselves, what are the English language questions that we want to know the answer to with our data analytics? And this cartoon really resonates with me, thinking, Kim, to our client that talked about years ago their mandate to use data analytics on every audit. And sure enough, within a year or so, they were using data analytics software on every single audit to pick their random sample of 25 transactions using an analytics random number generator. And what we want to do here is focus not on doing the same audit process that we've done before, but rather to take advantage of the things that we can have in our toolkit when we use analytics. The biggest single opportunity is to test the entire population as opposed to only a sample.
I think another opportunity, Joe, is that we've found quite useful is to the people that get involved in that brainstorming sessions, the organizational elements that I think sometimes we in internal audit tend to isolate ourselves during the planning process and go back to previous audits of the same part of our organization and pull audit specific plans out of that instead of looking at, I think at least at 2 areas, and I may come up with more than that as I ramble here, but you know, certainly that's a good starting point. But I think that asking people in the organization what they've become curious about for whatever reason. It might be reports that they're getting. It might be situations or issues that they're seeing. And again, brainstorming is just that. It's a creative process of touching various things that you become aware of for whatever reason, and just getting them on a board, getting them down somewhere, like on this brainstorming ideas whiteboard that's in this cartoon. And for me, I'm a data guy, and I think that one of the things that can also drive questions and brainstorming ideas is the data itself. If you look at the data that's being used by that organization in terms of what sources of data are used for the reporting in that organization, what are the basis for them making decisions, that you can begin to look at that and say, well, have you ever asked questions about the relationship of this data to that data? And again, not at the column level, but rather at the sort of how does that data support that organization in terms of answering the questions or providing the reporting data that they use to do their everyday work. So I think that the organizations and the people that get involved in the brainstorming can make a big difference.
Indeed. Well, that's exactly what we're gonna talk through. Got a couple of pictures to show folks, and then we're gonna share some of our brainstorming artifacts where we link those business questions to the data sources. Again, a couple of review slides for those of you that were able to make our session last week. And as Kim described, when we begin sharing some of our audit planning artifacts, right? The question, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first? Do I start with my data? Do I want to find out what tables and columns and rows I have available to me for this payroll audit? Or do I want to start with a whiteboard and ask and document the English language questions I might want to know the answer to for a payroll audit? If, what are the business objectives, the control objectives, the oversight objectives for review of HR and payroll processes? Do I want to begin with a list of English language questions and then go get the tables, or do I want to begin with the tables and then develop the questions? And I think what you'll find the short answer to that is yes. You'll want to do both. So again, here's our agenda. We're going to share some audit planning artifacts, and then we're also going to provide some wonderful free resources from automation, some process fact sheets that can be inspiration for you during the brainstorming process. So first we want to relate a story. Kim and I were at an Institute of Internal Auditors meeting, 3 months within founding our company back more than 10 years ago. And we were presenting along with a chief audit executive named David Pacer from an insurance company in the Carolinas. And we had a couple of other people on the panel. And I remember there was a question from the audience that said, what's the best way to get started with data analytics? And David's answer was, the best way to get started is to get started. That is the notion that the enemy of the perfect is the good, that if you are looking for the perfect brainstorming or the perfect data analytics audit project, you're going to spend an awful lot of time in planning, and you're not going to spend quite enough time in field work. So we would encourage to get started by beginning a simultaneous process of brainstorming, figuring out what are the English language questions that we want to know the answer to here at 12 o'clock on our QuickStart methodology, and then concurrent with those English language questions and brainstorming, to also have some or as much of the digital data is available. So when someone says, as an example, let's write a query to compare the time that the report is prepared compared to when that report has been reviewed and the evidence of the review, to see if there's a large amount of time taking place before review. That's a wonderful brainstorming question to ask. And in the world of expense reports and digital data sources like Concur for travel or maybe Blackline for account reconciliation, the evidence of the account reconciliation review in Blackline has a date stamp and a time stamp that's recorded as a column in the database. I think we've all worked in environments, though, where the evidence of the review is some squiggly initials at the top of a page, and while it may have a time or a date on it, the evidence of the initials is not an example of a digital data file that we can do any computations for. So again, understanding what are the English language questions that we want to know the brainstorming answers for, and being able to look into the digital data and see and understand whether that question can be answered digitally is very important. So during our brainstorming process, as we introduced last week, one of the things we encourage is documenting whether those questions are what we call confirmatory. That is, that we're answering a question, often a closed-ended question, and confirming that the digital data supports our assertion. Or is it exploratory, where we don't have a single objective in mind, but rather we're exploring the data, oldest to newest, biggest to smallest, etc. So this QuickStart methodology, everything begins with brainstorming and simultaneously wanting to look at both the English language questions and brainstorming together with the data acquisition is how we would recommend to get started. So with that, I think we're ready for our first polling question. Who's typically involved?
Our first polling question is, who is typically involved in your current audit brainstorming? Is it the data analytics team members, the financial operational audit team, or business process owners? Or is it a combination of any of these three? Please let us know amongst all of those. And just remember, you must respond to all three of the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. I'll give you guys a few more seconds and then I will review the results. So far, 89% have said that their financial and operational audit team are the most involved in their audit brainstorming, followed by the business process owners and the data analytics team members evenly. So great information.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Lindsay, how far down the percentage did it go when you got to A and C?
They were equal, both 28%. So that makes you.
Yeah, I just wanted to know the 28%. Yeah.
So that means there's some combination, but unfortunately, this doesn't tell me what the combinations were. So.
Right, understand.
It's interesting, right? So hearing almost 90% of the folks that it's primarily financial and operational, what I'm going to deduce from that data is that the people making the list of the brainstorming questions that they want to know the answer to, they may or may not have the insights into the digital data to know whether there are the right columns and rows and tables in the data sets to answer those questions. And I can see where it might be frustrating to spend time on brainstorming, identify what you think is an important question to know the answer to, and then after the brainstorming, when the data analytics audit professionals are kind of brought in to do the work, they start looking in the tables and columns and rows and find out, oh, that data is not available. I think from the experience, Kim, that you and I have, we would recommend a process that would have certainly the financial and operational audit folks. We would also recommend the data analytics team members be an integral part of the brainstorming. And the business process owners, again, less than a third of the respondents here so far are including the business process owners. I can perhaps think it's a good idea to do some brainstorming with just us internal audit folks before inviting the process owners to the table. But as you suggested, the idea of involving the process owners, we don't want to build a data analytics query to produce a report if that report is available from the current information systems environment. Why should we spend time building analytic reports already available from the system? So certainly involving the process owners at some point during the brainstorming we would recommend. Is it done at the beginning or shortly after the beginning? Don't have a strong opinion on that.
I like that a lot, Joe. I think that and I like the idea of the audit team starting it out. I mean, first of all, limiting it to that, I think all too many times that we've seen limits it, or typically starts the process and sometimes ends the process with what has been done previously, because you go back to previous audits and those get charged to the team as objectives for the current audit. And the opportunity really is to not necessarily to discard that, but to start with that, but then again, using the data as we talked on before, but also very importantly, the people from the organization that is the objective of the audit. I think that they will bring in fresh ideas, and they can be certainly keyed by the things that have been reviewed in the past. And as you said, some of those things may have been transformed from what originally was an audit query into something that they get every week or every month, and that there's really something available already for them to review and to gain knowledge from for their audit. So I think, and that is certainly something that we see. And so I think involving the operational folks in the planning process can be a huge benefit.
Indeed. Well, as we introduced last week, the notion of what skills your team members need to have to be effective at data analytics, and the highlight that we have here is really this notion of finance and audit domain expertise needs to be at the table, together with the data acquisition and manipulation skills, and to have both of those disciplines be an integrated part of the brainstorming. Beginning a data analytics project with just the data people misses the opportunity to have the greatest impact in terms of asking the most important questions for a particular audit. If back to my pharmaceutical days when I was with Bristol Myers Squibb, one of the audits that I was on was what we call a best pricing audit. We were making sure that if we were selling a particular pharmaceutical product to the government, that the government received the lowest price from any customer that we might have sold the same product to. So while I was capable of going in and getting tables and columns and rows and looking at the price and then 2 or 3 discounts in succession to understand a $5 pill with a 10% discount and a 50-cent rebate during the second quarter, as we may have sold it to a particular hospital, that it was at the best price. I needed to have the domain, the business, the industry experience to know whether the managed care 50-cent second quarter discount should be calculated before or after the 10% discount that we had in place. So again, the notion of having the finance and audit domain expertise together with the data acquisition skills are very important. And again, kudos to having almost 90% of the folks on the call, including their operational and financial auditors. But if we could get that number up to nearly 100, I think we'd even be better served. So before we talk about the brainstorming process, we thought it would be useful to talk about what's possible and what's better about IDEA and other data analytics tools compared to spreadsheets. And there's at least 4 or 5 differences between spreadsheets and tools like IDEA. The more obvious ones are the differences with file size, right? I've got 16,000 columns and maybe 1 million rows that I can have in the current version of Microsoft Excel. And with IDEA, I can handle much more than that. Certainly audit trails and the fact that inside of a spreadsheet, the spreadsheet can be changed and saved and overwritten, and that source data is easily changed. In the case of IDEA, we've got very good data integrity and a strong, reliable audit trail. Macros and scripting are fairly similar. Probably give a nice shout out here to the folks at Automation with respect to IDEA. Last time we needed help, Kim, you and I, with an Excel problem, I think we filled out a web form for Microsoft, and about a week and a half later, we got a reply to our email. With IDEA, you pick up the phone and you get a person, you get a wonderful, friendly person who probably knows you, and they're able to help. So I think if we were doing this slide over again, we'd probably add a shout out on the help desk. But the biggest difference, I think, is that the analysis can take place with multiple files when you're using IDEA, when you're analyzing the population of data. And if I want to do a join, we're doing some work for a banking client now, and they have a loan product that is securitized by other assets that are held at the bank, right? So if I want to have a $50,000 loan for a fancy car, and they look at my credit and they say, oh, you don't qualify for that car, Joe, but if you have a CD with us, or if you have a brokerage account with us, and the brokerage account has more than $50,000 in it, then yes, certainly, we will go ahead and loan you the $50,000. At the time that that loan is written, yes, maybe I do have $50,000 in the investment account. However, what about the second month? What about the third month? Maybe I moved the $50,000 in there. It was a temporary loan from a friend or a family member, and 30 days after the loan is created, then I sell the securities, or I give the securities back to the person who I borrowed them from. Identifying those loans where the collateral is no longer there is a very powerful test, much better than looking in the loan file, whether it's a manual file where you're seeing the pledge of the securities, or whether it's an electronic file. Again, having an up-to-date version where I'm joining from the collateral back to the loan, that join with the multiple data files is a much more powerful test. And that's the kind of testing that we're able to do with IDEA, with its scripting language, even sending alerts letting us know that a particular condition was okay when the transaction was originated, but became out of compliance shortly thereafter. So during,
and I think that's
go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I was going to focus as one of the key differences on the scripting. Yes, macros and scripting are similar, but they instantly diverge. Creating macros within Excel is something left to a pretty highfalutin expert. in my experience. But scripting an idea where they've created a visual way to do that, or a way to execute a series of commands in idea and then save it as a script so that it can become repeatable, is hugely different and hugely valuable, particularly in the situation you were just describing, Joe, where you want to, the situation you described is one where you did this initial test in idea, joining multiple files and identifying that, hey, this person's got the $50,000, they're okay. Well, what you really want to do, as you described, is repeat it. And scripting is all about repeatability and accurate and effective repeatability. And so I think that I like to focus as one of the most important elements on this chart is scripting, because the ability to redo things easily and effectively, particularly with digital data and multiple files, is an important differentiator and an important step down the road towards continual or repeated audits that can have exceptional value both to the audit team but also to the operational organization itself.
Joe, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Sorry, Lindsay. Was saying that we want to pull up an actual brainstorming document, just not quite enough room on the PowerPoint slide to let people see this entire artifact. But what we're doing here, and again, this is sort of a replica of what's on slide 10. But what we are doing in Excel is we're recording the English language question that we want to know the answer to, right? Who is the person that spends the most money? How does our travel spend break down between air or hotels or cars or meals? We also record so what, right? These are two of the most powerful questions an auditor can ask. So what? Why is this important? We're indicating that we're going to perhaps look at this with a ranking query or a Pareto chart. We're going to be doing time series analysis. And then out to the right, we're also listing the digital data files that we need to answer the English language questions that we're going to be documenting during our brainstorming session. So this is an example of one of those artifacts. And again, we would encourage very much the use of a similar artifact in your organization where you're identifying what you want to know the answer to, why is it important, what techniques, database left to join an idea or string commands or trimming, things that you might do to normalize the data. And again, what data sources you might need to answer those questions. So during the brainstorming, what we're doing is we're reviewing the business objectives. We're doing an audit of payroll. We're doing an audit of travel. Why are we doing an audit of payroll? Why are we doing an audit of travel? And what are the internal data sources that we have here at the company to ask and answer questions about those matters? An internal data source would be our HR master file. An internal data source would be our time card records or our payroll records. External data sources would be data sources that are not from our company ERP systems, but external data in the context of HR and payroll might be salary survey data from an external data source. Do we have an employee turnover problem at our company? What is the average turnover for the company by department, by job grade? certainly understanding external data sources and perhaps how we're paying our people relative to market, we'd want to have external data sources like market data. The fourth bullet here, part of brainstorming, we always want to consider our data analytics tests together with the other tests that we could do to answer those same business questions. Yes, it would certainly be something that data analytics could do to compare the salary data in HR and payroll to external data sources and indicate whether employee turnover we think might be caused by pay issues. But another way to understand whether pay issues are causing some of the employee turnover would be to read the exit interview notes that are available in paper files in HR. So yes, that's a good brainstorming question. Understand the root cause of employee turnover. But just because we can do a data analytics test and compare salary between our staff and external market indicators, just because we can do that doesn't mean that we necessarily should. So again, comparing the other audit tests, walkthroughs, reperformance, finding existing reports in our information systems, and answering those questions with existing reports, that's going to help your team brainstorm the best list of data analytics questions so that you can answer key business and control questions for the audit that you're working on. And
I think that's a real Yeah, I was just going to say, Joe, that I think that you're on a really key point, and that is, first of all, brainstorming should be free-form. You shouldn't edit while you brainstorm. Get all the questions down, including like the ones that you think, well, that might be marginal, and it might, or we've done it before and we didn't learn anything, or whatever. But get everything down, and then call it. Then go through with the data analytics folks and make sure that you have the data to do it. Then go through with the operational folks from the organization and see if they can answer it with other reports, or whether how they would prioritize it. And obviously you in internal audit will also have your opinions about how to prioritize it. But I think that last bullet there, focus on a small list of objectives, is really key, because we all love to leverage the data and answer as many questions as we can, but I think we can always do a better job if we have a list of the most important objectives and keep that list doable and probably redoable. Joe and I have the concept of pass one and pass two. You learn a lot by the first time you execute a query that feeds into the second or maybe even third time you do it. So ending up with a small list of objectives, I think, is really key to success.
Indeed. And the last thing I would mention in the brainstorming documentation is we've got these English language questions, the so what of why they're important, cross-referenced against the internal data sources or the external data sources that we might need to answer those questions. We'd also encourage documenting what kind of a question is it. Is it a metric query, right? We're going to just make me a list of the 10 biggest or the 10 smallest or the 10 oldest items. Make a list of outlier queries. Show me overtime by person or by department in the company, and do a time series chart, right? Show the overtime by month with comparison between the highest and the average, or the highest and the lowest amount of overtime. What I'm looking for there is just a relationship between the biggest and the smallest, or the biggest and the average. An exception query says, show me all people that had more than 25% overtime, where their overtime is a quarter as much as their base pay. if the expectation is that we shouldn't have any people who have 25% or more compensation through overtime alone, which might be a reasonable expectation. If we produce the exception query that says there are only one person or two people at our company that have that amount of overtime, we might feel good about the amount of overtime. However, if it's an organization with an unwritten rule that you better not have more than 25% overtime, otherwise the VP of HR is going to punish the managers for how much their people are working, then looking at exploratory queries and finding out how many people have 23% or 24% of their pay in overtime. Did they have a lot of overtime in the first 9 or 10 months, and then zero overtime from that point on, would be very different than if somebody was averaging 20 or 25% overtime throughout the year. So part of our documentation from our brainstorming queries are to indicate whether the query is a metric query or an outlier or an exception query, and also whether it's an exploratory query or a confirmatory query. Again, the way that we record these English language questions, the tasks that are needed from a data standpoint, and the techniques and the commands and the so what, and the data sources that are needed. This is an example of the brainstorming artifacts that we typically prepare, and that brings us to our second polling question. Lindsay?
Thank you. Our second polling question is, do you use reusable templates to document business and audit questions and then cross-reference those questions to digital data sources? Yes, no, or is this not applicable to you because your team hasn't started data analytics work yet? Just a reminder, we need you to answer all 3 questions to get CPE. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to respond. Most of you have already responded, so thank you. And then I will review the results. So far, the majority have actually said that they are not using reusable templates because they are new and haven't quite started with data analytics. So we're very glad that you're here so that you can learn the best approaches for when you do get started. And then we had 32% say that, yes, they do use reusable templates.
Very good. Very good. So in building your reusable template, what we would encourage to record are the following items that Kim and I have shared already, right? What plain English language questions do we want to know the answer to? We also want to identify what data sources we need to know the answer to those English language questions. Importantly, not just the single data source that we need, but maybe the multiple data sources. Again, with the banking collateralized loan example, or joining the HR file to the computer access list to see if there's anybody who has access to the computer, but the computer systems, but maybe are no longer on the payroll file. We want to know if the digital information that we need is in one file or perhaps in multiple. And then we also want to point toward what techniques. Is it an exploratory query, a confirmatory query, a metric, an outlier, or an exception query? And the last resource that we have for you on the webinar before we get to your Q&A, we want to make sure that people are aware of some wonderful free resources that are available from automation. And I'm going to switch out of PowerPoint here for a minute and go to the link that is in the handouts. And what you'll see here, automation.com, resources, and then areas of application. Right, here are tests specific for information security. So kind of a cross-industry application sheet. if my browser would please load.
Try the college
Sure.
and universities one. I know that one should be working. There we go.
Thank you, Lindsay. Here we go. So, colleges and universities, and there are ideas or inspirations here. If you're doing an audit of travel and expense, here are a couple of ideas. If you're auditing purchasing cards, a few more: tuition, salaries and payroll, etc. Same with financial aid. So what you have here with this list are some industry focused and some cross-industry focused items that are intended to be inspirational for folks. So we're a big fan of these sheets, and whenever we're involved in a project, we look there. We also look at IIA resources. Kim and I are working on a grant audit. There's a new IIA white paper about auditing grants in the public sector. And gosh, we've got a 44-page white paper that we're going through, looking for what English language questions might be important to include on our brainstorming worksheet when we're going in for the audit of a particular area. So certainly an important resource for you. And the last thing we wanted to leave folks with before our last polling question are what we call our exploratory queries checklist. And in our exploratory queries, I'm thinking, Kim, of some stuff that we've done more recently, right? We're doing an overtime audit for an organization right now. We're doing some Medicare health claims audits for a different organization. We haven't written our confirmatory queries yet. The client has provided us a data file, and we're calculating some summary statistics, which everyone knows you can do very quickly in IDEA. We're calculating the average, the median, the 5 highest, the 5 lowest, a range of values. We're sorting from biggest to smallest, oldest to newest. I've got some leave codes, right? I've got, I'll relate a good story here on marital status, right? We've got a file I remember working with years ago, and the marital status had S and M and D and W, and it also had a 4. And I certainly recognize M, likely married, D, likely divorced, S, likely single, W, maybe that was widowed. But what did the 4 mean? And it turns out that the HR system that they used prior to the one that they were using currently, in that old system, they had 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the old system, 1 was single and 2 was married and 3 was divorced. But there was something with the mapping from the old system to the new system such that they had new employees that had the marital status of 4 that was carried over from the old information system, and that the old information system hadn't been properly mapped right. So in calculating some health insurance costs and some other employee deductions, everything was being computed right for the M's and the D's and the S's and the W's. But for the 4s, those were actually being computed incorrectly, and some people had over withholding, or in 1 or 2 cases under withholding for insurance, because the status codes hadn't been created right.
I think that's a really, I think that's a really important use that we don't always talk about for exploratory queries. I mean, we think about metrics queries, the things that add up, the totals or the number of rows in a particular data set, to be sort of the way that we use and do control totals. But I think what we found quite a number of times, Joe, in our work, is that when we get into these exploratory queries, that they point out data anomalies or understanding or documentation anomalies in exactly the kind of situation that you described, which is conversion wasn't done quite right, or the restrictions on a particular set of code values isn't properly codified, and so bad data is sneaking in. So as you do exploratory queries, you might even find issues with the data itself that leads you back to recommendations to your organization to tighten up, and it could be the IT or maybe even the operational organization to tighten up certain elements of their controls and as they enter new information or maintain it.
That's a good example. I think the other direction I want to go with that, hearing your example there, Kim, are some of the things that we do around travel and entertainment, where we're trying to identify if any organization may be entertaining foreign government officials, right? Concur has the primary file of expenses. What are the monies that we're spending on meals? They also have an attendee file, and the attendee file lists the names of the people who were at a business meal. And we worked with an organization that thought it would be a good idea to compare the names of the attendees against OFAC lists, right? The Office of Foreign Asset Control, the terrorist watch list, the politically exposed person list. And it's a very good idea, a very clever use of joining multiple files. And if there's a match between the attendee file and the OFAC list or the politically exposed person list, that would be a very important test to know. However, with that said, when we did a quick look of the file, we found it was very common for people in filling out their expense reports to say guest or customer or vendor, as opposed to saying Kim Jones, Managing Director of Visual Risk IQ. So doing the join between guest or customer and the politically exposed person list was not going to be nearly as interesting. Looking at what data columns are null, how many of the attendees had a valid name versus how many of them were blank or gibberish, those are just good examples of exploratory queries so that organizations don't spend too much time during brainstorming, planning for a test, and then finding that the digital data doesn't support that. So again, free and wonderful resources from automation here. Encourage folks to bookmark that, look at IIA guidance and other areas, and then also just talk to your industry peers. And with that, we'll switch, I think, Lindsay, to our third polling question, and then we'll have Q&A from the group.
Thank you. Yes, our last polling question is, prior to today's webcast, were you aware of the automation resources for IDEA or data analytics applications? No, yes, but we hadn't looked at them, or yes, and we use them often. As Joe has said, these are a great resource. We are continually working on them and adding new ones, and we hope that you will continue to check back and use those as ways to brainstorm how you can, other areas where you can be looking at, and just ways to make your audits better. So far, 56% of the audience had not been aware of them, and 44% were aware, but didn't use them as much as they possibly could. And again, I hope that you answered all three of the questions because all three need to be responded to in order to get CPE. I also want to go ahead and open the floor for questions right now. If you have any questions, please put them and type them into the questions box, and we will try to get to them in just a second. I'm not seeing any questions right now, Joe.
Well, the one that we wanted to cover, if there weren't any, because we did plan for that contingency here, Lindsay, was to talk about the relationship between brainstorming and data acquisition. As you know, next week's webinar is on data acquisition. It's going to be a bit more technical, some of the tips and tricks of getting digital data files loaded into IDEA or your visualization tool, IDEA and your visualization tool. And the question that we envisioned was, at what point in the brainstorming do I need to go look at my data source to make sure that the question that I want to know the answer to is supported in the digital data? Kim, do you want to cover that? When do you feel is best to have the data file available as it relates to brainstorming? Would you do it same day, next day?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a data guy, so the earlier the better. I just think that I do think that some brainstorming needs to occur. I mean, sort of a combination of what have we done in the past, what are we curious about that was generated from what we've heard around our organization, and get some questions going that begin to point us at some of the data. But then, as you said early on, concurrent with that, understanding from some combination of the folks in the organization and your own knowledge, and also the querying IT, what are the sources of the data that are used for that organization doing its job every day. And I think the earlier you have some data, the earlier you can begin sort of brainstorming around the data itself. And again, being a data person, I like to sort of look through the columns that are there, and sometimes the values, but I mean, it can be in a spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be, in some highly technical form, but just looking at what's there will many times provoke a curiosity. I mean, it could be around the kind of exploratory queries you were just touching on that say, well, geez, I wonder how many people have this attribute about them. And again, that just ends up on the brainstorm list, and maybe it's just an exploratory query that doesn't result in a true audit objective, but one outcome of an audit can certainly be recommendations around data quality, which is where we were kind of going with some of those exploratory query stories. And I'm a big fan of getting the data early.
And I think I would agree that in a perfect world, having data at the brainstorming session the day before, the day of, is really helpful. That allows us to go in and explore the status codes, explain the blank values, explain the negative values. When we're doing our statistics, do we want to exclude all of the credits and only do our statistics on the debits? Do we want to look at the absolute value? Having the data file together when we're doing the brainstorming can certainly help. On that notion of statistics, we did have a statistics question come in back to our body of knowledge. The question was, how much statistical knowledge do we want to use in our exploratory queries? Do we go as far as regression and distribution? I think our answer to that would be to go as far as you're comfortable going during the regression analysis. Certainly doing a scatter plot, certainly calculating mean, standard deviation, distribution are entirely appropriate as part of exploratory queries. If you're comfortable with statistics, then absolutely, let's describe correlation. Kim and I have an analytics project that we're in process on around demand forecasting. What is the amount of inventory that we ought to have at each of our locations, and what are the comfortable levels of inventory to have at each location around the country? Currently, the organization is having a fairly standard stock list, a fairly standard inventory at each of the locations. And what we are doing in some of our exploratory queries is running some regression analysis to compare stock outs and excess inventory against other variables that are endogenous or internal to the data set. By location, are we having more stock outs in the south or the north? Are we having more stock outs in the winter or the summer on some of the items that are carried in the store? And again, being able to do some basic regression and seeing whether the stock outs are correlated with weather or correlated with location is an exploratory query that's absolutely part of the project. Lindsay, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we're a few minutes to the top of the hour.
I haven't seen any others come in. Thank you for sharing your brainstorming methodology with us. It really is the most important part of the audit. Otherwise, you don't know if you're going to have the right information. And thank you to our attendees for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Have a good day, everyone. Have a good Friday.
Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.